Hello and welcome to the VSC podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma, or those who have experienced violence, and have conversations about social issues. My name is Jenarine, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the Education and Prevention Coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. In this podcast, we discuss sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace, or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. For the Florida State Sexual Helpline, call 888-956-7273. And by contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. In today's episode, I have with me Nicola Prichard, who is one of VSC's amazing crisis counselors and victim advocates. She is here to provide more information on toxic masculinity and the effects that stereotypes in male gender roles have in society. Before we start, I do want to set the stage by providing some context into what toxic masculinity is and the negative effects that it has. So, to start, toxic masculinity involves cultural pressures for men to conduct themselves in a certain way. For example, men who cry are weak is an example of a cultural masculine norm that has been perpetuated in society. This perception and belief that men need to be tough and emotionless can not only be harmful to their mental health, but also have negative repercussions in society. This is why it is called toxic masculinity, and these cultural masculine pressures encompass 5 values and traits. The first of these being power over women. As I recently mentioned, in our society today, masculinity is seen as dominant, tough, and unbreakable. Society has conditioned men into believing that feminine norms, such as crying and expressing emotions, make them fragile, delicate, and vulnerable. That effect this has is that it leads some men into having a perceived sense of superiority over women who do display emotions. In their perspective, this is weak, and they feel more entitled and powerful because of this. The second value and trait that toxic masculinity encompasses is intimate partner violence. Another aspect of toxic masculinity lies in control. In society, men are the ones who typically make important decisions and hold power in a relationship. So when some men feel that their authority is being questioned by their significant other, they will use violence to end any attempt their partner may bring to challenge their decision or perspective. In their minds, their male status is being threatened, and in order to regain their authority and control, some men will use physical abuse and violence. The third value and trait that toxic masculinity encompasses is aggressive behavior. We have been taught that men who are strong and heroic are Prince Charmings. And when they use physical force in fights or in sports, some men believe that they are defending their masculine honor, when in fact, it is unnecessary and foul play. The fourth value and trait is emotional detachment. As I explained earlier, toxic masculinity discourages men from showing emotions and tapping into their feelings. Crying is shunned upon, and being vulnerable is seen as weak. So some men refuse to express themselves because of this gender norm. The fifth value and trait is heterosexual self-presentation. From an early age, many boys have been taught that their behavior proves their sexuality. And in being submissive, passive, gentle, and nurturing, among other feminine characteristics, this is seen as homosexual. So what has happened is that in order to assert and approve their heterosexuality, some men over-sexualize women by making suggestive comments and taunting individuals who are homosexual. And I do want to add one more value and trait that I recently read, and it wasn't in this research study that explained the 5 values, but number 6 is male flight. Male flight is essentially when men boycott activities, products, or jobs that are associated with women. For example, cheerleading. Men will not pursue the sport because it is viewed as feminine, and they do not want to be perceived in the same light or context as these women. So, in order to retain their masculine image and dominance, they will not join the sport. And Nicola will talk more about this later on. But essentially, these 6 cultural norms that society has imposed has encouraged domestic and sexual violence. Because in order to prove their authority, some men feel that it is necessary to exert physical violence, force, and over-sexualize women. This culture translates into violence towards others, and as you can see, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men experience severe intimate partner physical violence, intimate partner contact sexual violence, and/or intimate partner stalking, with impacts such as injury, fearfulness, post-traumatic stress disorder, use of victim services, contraction of sexually transmitted disease, and others. I did put this link down in the description below if you are interested in reading more statistics as it relates to gender violence. So, with this all being said, I'm so excited to get into this podcast and introduce Nicola Prichard. Nicola, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Hannah.
Okay, so we're talking about toxic masculinity today. And I want to know what comes to your mind when you think of toxic masculinity?
So, toxic masculinity to me is kind of this idea of there's one kind of way to be masculine, and it has to be this, like, I guess, like the definition of like strong, like no emotions. You have to be this kind of like, and I hate this phrase, but like alpha male, where you're not allowed to show any like vulnerability or talk about feelings, and you're supposed to be this like stoic individual, and it kind of dictates as well like what activities you can do. And if something is too feminine, like you can't do that because that's like too womanly or whatever, and it doesn't fit into that idea of what a man is. And so the reason that it's toxic masculinity, to me at least, is because as much as a lot of men will subscribe to this idea, it actually ends up hurting them in the long run, because one, it limits what they can do. And there are things that men may enjoy, but they can't do that because it doesn't fit into that idea of what a man is. But then if you think about like even therapy, like a lot of men won't go to therapy because of this idea that men don't need to go to therapy or shouldn't be discussing feelings, but that could be beneficial to them. It's just they can't do that because of this idea of what men can and cannot do.
Right. And what would you say breeds this masculine or toxic masculinity? Like, where does it come from?
Um, I think a lot of it is these gender roles that have just been like established throughout time. So these ideas of what is for a man and what is for a woman. And so I think a big part of that is misogyny, and how, you know, men don't want to be seen as feminine, or there's this idea of being like emasculated. And if they do anything that's feminine, that becomes a big issue for the men around them. And that can lead to violence even, or harassment for what they're doing, those kinds of things. And I think a lot of it is just this idea that they need to conform in order to feel comfortable in the space around them, so that they're not harassed or made fun of, or even attacked, or there's violence against them for that kind of thing.
Right. And I would say that, like, in addition to that, I've like through my readings too, a lot of cultures and society as well, they impose these like preconditioned like beliefs and ideas and norms, cultural norms about how men and young boys need to be. And especially like it can even go further in depth if we talk about like Disney movies, because men, they always have to be like these heroic people saving like the woman in distress, and they're like providers, and they're the ones that are like, like strong, and they don't show emotion. So thank you so much for explaining that. One thing that stuck out to me is when you said misogyny. So from your personal experience, how does misogyny show up in toxic masculinity?
I think it's, kind of this idea of like going back to kind of what you said about the Disney movies in the media.
Mhm.
Like we get a lot of our conditioning from the
Right,
media we consume. And so then there are these ideas of, these examples of this is what's for a woman and this is what's for a man. And if you look at, so men take part in these activities, like even if you look at certain like careers, like someone's, let's say like a flight attendant or a cheerleader, and they will get a certain level of disdain for doing those things. But the only reason that they get that is because of the fact that those careers seem more feminine. Or let's say like a man wears makeup and then people get really upset about that. Well, men will often get really upset about that, and that's like not for them. But the only reason that that's not for them, in quotes, is that that's an it's seen as a feminine thing to do. So the whole reason that it kind of comes back to misogyny is that those feminine things that they're doing are seen as negative just based on the fact that they're feminine, or they're seen as what a woman should be doing, or they fit into that definition of what a woman is. So it's kind of this idea that if men take part in things that are like meant for women, that's bad inherently to these people. So it's kind of this thing of like, in order to see that as negative, you have to somewhat hate the fact that it's feminine.
right, right. And I love that you said that. And there's actually something that I recently learned too called male flight. And in the beginning of the podcast, I spoke about how to in male flight, men, they boycott like feminine activities. So for example, like cheerleading. And even in the workplace to do, like now when you think about nursing, men will not pursue those careers because they automatically assume that, okay, nursing is associated with a woman and I am not feminine, so I don't want to pursue that. So that really speaks extensively about that. Can you go a little more in depth about male flight, or is there anything else that you think people should know?
Yeah, so you kind of hit it on the head with the cheerleading, and that's a great example because if you think about cheerleading as a whole, it started out as this all male activity, and I think it was Princeton that it initially kind of like became this big thing, and it was only for men. And then around World War II, because of many men were fighting in the war, when they came back, so many women had kind of filled the gaps that it became this feminine activity, and then they no longer wanted to take part in that because it was too feminine for them. And if you look at that, even that, the way that cheerleading evolved from that point became very heavily kind of like pandering to the male gaze. So if you look at the way that the uniforms changed and the way that they did cheerleading, like the different routines and things that they do like that, became heavily influenced by like what do heterosexual men want to see.
Right.
And so for men to take part in that, it kind of created this thing where it's like, again, it comes back to misogyny. Like they don't want to take part in something that's like for a woman.
Hmm.
Um, and as well, it kind of gets into like homophobia and those kinds of ideas of they don't want to be taking part in something that's like meant for men to look at in that way. Um, but I think as well, if you look at like even just small examples like skincare, if you think about how that's like seen as feminine,
Hmm.
and even just sunscreen, like I think for a long time men wouldn't wear sunscreen, but if you think about the implications of that, they're more at risk for skin cancer or sun damage, those things, just because using sunscreen seems feminine. So it's kind of this idea of like they're boycotting things that could be beneficial for them, but just because it's feminine and for women, they don't want to do it. So it's kind of like that idea. And Sorry, I'm like rambling right now,
No,
but
that's okay. Please go ahead, Nicola. We love to hear from you.
even with like careers, like you mentioned, um, it makes me think of psychology. And this was actually something that I took a feminist psychology class in college, and it kind of reminded me of this.
Yeah.
But we had spoken about like the field of psychology, and if you think about like therapy, psychologists, social workers, like any of those fields now, many of the classes, like even in my degree, there were only like maybe maximum like 5 men in the class. And it's very heavily dominated by women. And if you think back to like the days of like Freud and early psychology, it was a very male dominated profession. And so there's this idea, and this is kind of getting into like a whole bunch of other stuff, but that, with certain careers, like you mentioned, like nursing, and now they're seeing it in even like medical school, there's more women than men in that field. And obviously this is like kind of talking to binary right now. Obviously there are people who are non-binary in these professions as well. Um, but this kind of goes into these ideas of why are men leaving the field, and is it because of this idea of male flights? Is it because the field is becoming more feminine, and is that the reason? And then it kind of gets into the pay gap, which it's a whole thing, because then
It's like a
as
cycle.
women,
Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
as women enter the field, at this current state that we're in, women get paid less than men.
Yeah.
So that kind of causes salaries to drop, and then men don't want to be in a field where the median salary is lower. So then they start leaving the field. And is it because of that? But then some people disagree, and some people say, psychology as a whole, the salaries were becoming stagnant, and men wanted to go and do something that paid more, and so then women filled the gaps. So it's kind of this idea of like, it's hard to tell where it comes from sometimes,
Mm.
but it's like a chicken and the egg situation. Like you don't really know which one came
Right, like which
first.
one came first? I love that. I love that you said that. So I know we're speaking a lot about toxic gender roles, but for those who aren't familiar with like cultural roles imposed upon women, so when we think about nurses, when we think about therapists, or even like when it comes to skincare, what would you say are characteristics that are portrayed for women to like be in these roles or be doing these activities that men are like, okay, I don't want to be identified as that?
So I think it's this idea of women being like, it's this kind of like matronly idea, like
Mhm.
comforting. And if you look at therapists and nurses, they take care of others, and um, it's very focused on like giving to people and being this comforting, like motherly presence for people, or wanting to be like delicate. Like if you look at skincare, even like the whole thing with there's like women's shaving,
Right.
but it's like we have the same skin. Like it's really not that different, but it's kind of this idea that we're like these delicate people who can't be in these careers where, even if you look at like firefighters, police officers, like where it's seen as like these like more masculine roles where women have to, even in those careers, conform to these like masculine ideas in order to get anywhere in the career. It's seen as like not for women because that's not delicate enough, or that's not
Mhm.
caring enough, or that kind of thing. And but the kind of like converse side of that is that it's saying that men are not these things. So men cannot be sensitive or comforting to others or caring, those kinds of things, when obviously anyone can have these characteristics. And um but I think a lot of these careers and a lot of these things that are seen as for women are kind of based on this idea of women being these like delicate, fragile people who are just there to like serve others, be comforting, be this like presence for others, and less so like for personal achievements, things like that. It's like very focused on giving to others.
Right. So, how would you say, or how does toxic masculinity and gender roles that are imposed on men and women and also people that are non binary breed inequality.
So, and this kind of goes back to what we discussed before, is even with like the pay gap, if you think about the careers that become more female or, dominated by women and non-binary people, it's very much so like the pay differential that you see is very evident. Even if you look at like computer science versus like a social worker's salary, there's both obviously important roles in society, but there's a huge difference in what you see in computer science. Is a very male dominated field.
Right.
And so, you know, again, I'm not going to comment on like what came first or how this occurred, but um, these roles and the way that people enter the field kind of stem from these ideas of toxic masculinity. And then it ends up going into these ideas of, the pay is less, or even if you look at like, and it's a silly concept, but like prestige of like a certain career. And even if you look at in college, people doing like a major in psychology, it's seen as like easy, like a frivolous career. But if you're doing like engineering, it's like prestigious and those kinds of things. So it's like it starts really from these ideas of like what men and women can do. That becomes what careers can I do? What can I take part in? What activities can I take part in? And then eventually adds up to there's difference in pay, there's difference in prestige, there's difference in, what degrees someone gets, the level of respect someone gets in the workplace. Like it adds up to all these things that just kind of become this like snowball effect.
Right. And I love that you said that because something that I've also been recognizing is when I tell people like what I do, I'm a violence prevention educator, I'm a speaker. They kind of look at me and they're like, "Oh, you're a speaker, like you're a public speaker." I didn't know that that's something that you'd want to do. Like, and then I'd have people tell me, "Oh, why didn't you go into nursing?" That's a career right now where people are going, and since COVID happened, like, we need nurses. Or and even when I was younger and I wanted to be a lawyer, I would tell like, people, they'd be like, "Oh, you want to be a lawyer?" They're like, "Oh, why don't you be a nurse?" And it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like they fit women and men and also non-binary people into like this box. So there's this thing called like the man box where you were saying that men can only be like dominating and domineering, and then women is they're like soft and delicate and fragile. And also what I've noticed is that when women they start to exert their, I don't want to say force, but I want to say use their voice to kind of say, okay, no, I don't want this. Or when they even say no, it's kind of looked at like, wow, like she's really, I don't want to curse on this podcast, but you know what I'm saying. Like she's very annoying, or she's very bossy, or
Mhm.
she's trying to, be powerful, but she's not. Whereas when a man says, "No, this is not what I want to happen. This is unacceptable." We look at him and we're like, "Wow, this is somebody that I respect. This is someone that I want to vote for." So it once again, like you said, the chicken or the egg, you don't know what comes first. But when it comes to society and the inequality that it breeds, it happens in so many different aspects. So in like the workforce, in the
Mhm.
pay gaps, and like how people perceive you as well, like what they
Mhm.
say. And especially those of you who don't know, Nicola and I, we are not the tallest people in the world. So but when they see us, people kind of like, they're like, "Why don't you be a teacher? Like, like you're so cute. Kids will like you." Like, no, that's not how it works. So thank you for saying that, Nicola. I
Well,
want
and
to,
also, oh,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, go ahead. No, no, no,
I
I'm
was gonna
sorry.
say, you brought up a good point as well about this kind of idea of when women do take on more of like an assertive role, they're kind of looked at differently. And something that I think is interesting as well with that is like if you look at, I'm trying to think of like a field where this, like for example, in like computer science or technology,
Yeah,
and there are certain companies where if you look at like upper management leadership roles where there is a woman, that a lot of the characteristics that they have are these like they're seen as masculine if you meet
yes.
them, but it's like they're not masculine, they're just assertive or they have certain characteristics that people will say, well, they have to develop those characteristics to survive in that workplace, and to get to where they got to, they needed to be more masculine. But it's like, why are those things inherently masculine?
Mm.
Like that's being assertive is not like only for men. Like that's not how it works. But it's funny to me that, and there's even the idea of like how some men in the workplace feel like they don't get respected because they have more feminine qualities. But it's
Mhm.
like, there's nothing inherently feminine or masculine about any of these qualities. But even when a woman is successful and is, let's say like, obviously, I feel like it's given that most people, there will be grumblings of complaints about women who are assertive. But let's say they do have that respect from others around them and they are in, a leadership position, that kind of thing. It's never just because, oh, like they're a great worker, they like do these things well, they're very assertive. It's like they became more masculine and so then they got that position. Which makes
Exactly.
no sense to me because I'm like, it doesn't make sense.
Me too, Nicola. Me too. And the thing is, masculinity and femininity, I think they go hand in hand because there's no one person that's only like masculine, and there's no one person that's feminine. Like everyone has their own characteristics to them. Like there are men who are sensitive and they're assertive as well. There are women who are assertive, they say no, but then again, like they also have like that nurturing side to them. Men can also be nurturing. So I think it's time that we normalize these characteristics and stop like imposing these preconceived, like back in the day, kind of like beliefs about how men and women should be. And it's just, I don't want to say it's amazing, but it's just like disturbing to me that like notions in like the 17 and 1800s are still, they still affect us to this day, because there are people who still have these like beliefs that no, women should stay at home, men should be the sole providers. But I guess, we got to start from somewhere.
You know who I feel like right now, and this is kind of like, I don't know if this has to do with this, but I feel like it's like the perfect example of toxic masculinity and this
Let's
whole
hear
thing
it.
we're talking about
Let's
is
hear it.
Andrew Tate. Because if
Yes.
you think about everything that he stands for, obviously there is like clear misogyny, there is clear like this whole, and this is what I was saying, this like alpha male, which is a disgusting phrase and I hate it, but this idea of this is how you be a man, but his definition of men, and it's not his definition, it's because that he didn't just come up with that. That's like
Right. He's just
around,
open about it.
yes. And he learned that from somewhere, like it didn't just, was not the first man on earth to say this, but if you look at the way, and obviously now with his human trafficking case and, charges for sexual assault and everything, it's even more disturbing, but his whole view on women and view on masculinity is kind of based on this idea of violence. Like women should be serving men, and even he says it directly, so it's not even like you have to like interpret anything, but
Yeah.
it is this idea of there's one way to be a man, and if you're not that way, you'll get made fun of online. You're not a real man, and women are this like property for men to own, that kind of thing, which again is like, what doesn't make sense too about this is that it's so binary, and there's
Mhm.
no, because then it's like, what about the non-binary people? Where do they fit in? Obviously that gets into like transphobia and homophobia and those kinds of ideas, and it's kind of like, yes, there's misogyny, but then there's also just like every other kind of bigotry involved the
Yes.
more you get into it. And I just feel like Andrew Tate is like the perfect example of toxic masculinity. Even, if you think about his beef with Greta Thunberg, that was, the whole thing was based on this idea of like, I don't care about the earth because
Yeah.
look at how manly this car makes me. And it's this thing of like, why does having like massive emissions of CO2 make you like manly and
Manly.
strong when that has nothing to do with anything? It's just kind of like, it's for the sake of being like, I don't care about this. And that kind of idea of masculinity is not caring about things that matter to people. And it's just like this, it's not good for men, and it's kind of disturbing to see how many young men are following him on his platforms and kind of endorsing this view now.
Mhm.
Um, so that's upsetting, but that just kind of came to mind when we were talking about toxic masculinity right
No, I
now.
love that you said that too. And a point that really struck with me is that how you said this misogyny and this bigotry is leading, in a sense, not in a sense, but leading to domestic violence and also sexual violence. Because when, okay, now that men think or men feel that they need to be the one making all the decisions,
Mhm.
they're the providers. So now when they have, like, I'm speaking about heterosexual men. So now when they have a wife or now when they have a girlfriend and that girlfriend challenges their beliefs or challenges them, their first instinct is you're questioning my power, or I'm the one here that makes the decisions. So now the man will abuse that woman. He'll hit her to silence her, or he'll sexually abuse her as well. So that goes like even further.
Hmm. No, and it
So
is, I feel like violence is kind of at the core of what toxic masculinity is. And, we spoke about how it kind of comes from this idea of misogyny. Um, and then I know we've kind of touched on how it gets into other kinds of bigotry, but even if you think about hate crimes against like gay men or people who are
yes.
transgender, it's this idea of something about them is threatening the idea of
Masculinity
what
is.
masculinity is. And even though they're not doing anything, a lot of men, because they've kind of been indoctrinated with this idea of like, this is what masculinity is, if they look at them and feel any kind of way about it, it's like it becomes violence because that's what, and again, going back to Andrew Tate, if you look at the way that he tells men, like, if women do this, violence, or if you see this, violence. So it's very based on this idea of violence. And if you think about like misogyny or any kind of bigotry, at the end of the day, that comes back to violence of some kind. And
Exactly.
I think toxic masculinity is kind of, sometimes it's just talks about like this like silly concept where it's like men should be men, whatever that means,
Yeah.
that whole thing. But it's like at the end of the day, this has real world consequences that end up being violent for, even if you look at like incel culture, that whole thing is based on misogyny, and this idea toxic masculinity is very much a big part of incel culture. And even like a lot of right wing extremism is kind of based on this idea of toxic masculinity. And at the end of the day, that comes back to violence against women, violence against people in the LGBTQ community. That's kind of what it always comes back to. And so, as much as, yes, we're talking about like men should be able to express their feelings, and it sounds like these like soft concepts, as some
Hmm.
people would say, it's not. It's about violence prevention and preventing, even if you think about it, like suicide at the
Yeah.
end of the day. Because men don't have a place to go a lot of the time if they feel like they're not even supposed to be feeling these things. So then it comes back to this idea of like seeking help is not feminine. That's not, emasculating, whatever, to go and seek help for something. So then it's violence prevention, it's preventing deaths, it's preventing a lot of things. So sorry, this kind of went like all over the place, but
No, keep going, Nicola. I'm like fascinated right now. Thank you
no,
for
it's
sharing.
it's just this idea of violence, I guess, at the end of the day is what really just sticks out to me, is like the overarching theme of all of this.
It's violence. That's you actually answered my next question because you touched on the LGBTQ plus community. And my question was, how does toxic masculinity and male flight impact this community? So it's violence, but I also want to add that it also instills fear into them
Hmm.
because now they're more fearful to come out because now people like Andrew Tate and other masculine celebrity figures, they have this notion and they're spreading their hateful speech against these communities, and young people are being influenced by them. So then they start to also develop these, belief systems where, yeah, if you're a part of the LGBTQ plus community, like that just goes against, masculine traits, and we hate you. And, and then this is where hate crimes come in. So people start attacking that community. And I'm sure you know this, but just for our listeners, in the transgender individuals, within like transgender women, 1 out of every 2 transgender women are sexually assaulted. And that is higher than heterosexual and cisgender women, because it's 1 in 3. I'm not saying that's like not a high number, because that's very high, but 1 in 6 men, but also 1 in 2 transgender individuals, like that is absurd to me. And it just shows like they face a higher victimization rate, and also they're more prone to being victimized by, people who have these belief systems. So violence is what happens from having these beliefs.
Yeah, and if you look at even this idea of, people in the LGBTQ plus community being victimized at a higher rate, if you look at sexual assault, say specifically, the whole reason, the whole purpose behind most sexual assaults is this idea of power and,
Control.
domination and control. And so it makes a lot of sense if you look at the situation where men are being told, you need to have the power, you need to be in control of the situation. A lot of time, and this is what kind of we spoke about before, it's not that these people are doing anything, they're just living their lives, being themselves, but something about them, because of this idea of toxic masculinity, is threatening to a lot of heterosexual men who subscribe to this idea of what masculinity is. And so a lot of this violence comes from a place of they feel like they are regaining control by victimizing this person, which is obviously beyond disturbing. And it's just unfortunate because it's that person living their life has nothing to do with that person.
Mm-hmm.
This is why it is toxic masculinity, because one, it's obviously not good for everybody else, but it's like pushes people to violence, and it tells people that violence is the only way to solve anything or to feel like you're in control of your life, which obviously is not true. And it just creates this environment where other people have to be afraid because
Mm-hmm.
of men needing that power and control. And it's funny to me because even if you look at like certain items, like going back to male flights, like wigs and makeup, and like if you look at a lot of things that are now part of like even drag culture, or transgender individuals wearing makeup, or non-binary individuals wearing makeup, or even just men wearing makeup and wigs and doing whatever they want, that's those things used to be very heavily used by men. Like if you look at like Louis the 14th, he was like a pioneer in like wearing wigs because they were just like, this is cool. And even in like parliaments, they'll wear wigs, and the founding fathers wore wigs, and
Yes,
everyone,
they did.
and like going back to like ancient Egypt, like they wore wigs, like, and makeup. And there were a lot of people, like if you look back in like the 1800s, a lot of men wore makeup, and it wasn't this like, I'm sure there were grumblings of like, this is strange, but like it was seen as like this status symbol, and how
Mhm.
you can, like a lot of the people who were seen as like upper class wore these wigs, and it was like so important. But now if you look at it, it's like as it became more feminine, it's now this thing of like, if a man wore a wig, it's like questionable, or like
Right.
it threatens this idea of masculinity, which is so ridiculous because it's like it really is just a made up concept at the end of the day, because these ideas of what's masculine and feminine change all the time over history. And it's not this thing that you're like born and you're like feminine based on like inherent qualities, it's all just made up. And so it just makes the violence that comes from that more devastating to me, because it's not real, it's not a real concept, it's just this thing that was created and is sold to a lot of men when they're young and vulnerable. to make
Hmm.
them feel like they have a sense of control in the world, and then that leads to violence against others, and especially in the LGBTQ community. And it's just devastating and disappointing that that's kind of where it gets to.
Yeah, and then I think also like it's so important now that like the messaging that's out there on social media and even in the media is so important, and it's also like it hurts and it disturbs me to know that there are people out there who are still spreading this message. And then there are young boys who, maybe they're taught from their culture that this is how they're supposed to be as men. But then, like, instead of, as they get older, instead of kind of like opening their minds and exploring and saying, actually, no, like, I can also have feminine traits, I can also be assertive and nurturing, like they don't want to do that, because then there's like Andrew Tate that comes in and that affirms like their preconceived, notion that this is how I'm supposed to be. So they're like, okay, like this is who I'm supposed to listen to. And I just, it bothers me, and it's disturbing because, as many of us as such, like you and I, that are out there, they're like promoting, non-toxicity and non-toxic gender roles, there are people out there who are also fighting to preserve it. So I don't like it. But Nicola, do you think it will be difficult to break this cycle of toxic gender roles?
I think it is difficult, to be honest. And I think it depends. And I think also an important thing to touch on is there are a lot of women who subscribe to toxic masculinity as well. And it makes me think of, I don't remember the name right now, but there are, I mean, there's many of them, but there are some, like YouTube accounts of people who will put out like dating advice. And it's all essentially toxic masculinity. It's like, don't date these men who are like not masculine. And it kind of spreads this idea. And, as women also endorse this, it becomes this thing of like, if men are not like that, then like they're not going to find someone to be with, or they're not going to be attractive, and it gets into these like insecurities that people can have. And so it's hard to change this in a quick way, and I think it is changing over time. And I think as there's more education about mental health and about
Hmm.
violence against women and violence against people in the LGBTQ community, things like that. I think that it's slowly changing. I
Hmm.
would like it to be faster, but this is where we are right now. And it's, as you said, as much as there are people like us who are talking about this and like, masculinity can be whatever you want it to be, there are still so many people who subscribe to this idea. And I know you've kind of had experiences where you go and do like trainings, and it's like, we don't often encounter people who think like this in our workplace and like that kind of environment. But then when you do, it's like so jarring sometimes to be like, oh, these people are still out there, like they're still doing that. And you go on social media and it's like, wow, there are a lot of people still feeling like this. And I think it's changing slowly, but I think it will be difficult kind of because of that idea of how many people there still are
Right.
supporting these ideas.
Hmm. And it's funny that you said that, because I actually can share an example of during a training, somebody actually did say this. So, for those of you who don't know, I'm the violence prevention educator, and I go around Orange, Osceola, and Seminole counties, and I prevent trainings on sexual assault awareness and prevention, along with many other topics. But this particular training that I did was on like combating rape culture. So, I give out like these pre-tests and these post-tests. And after the post test, this person, you tell me what you think, Nicola. So this person said, nobody cares about gender bias and you should go clean a house. And like that, I don't remember what they said after, but it was like hateful. But they were like, you should, I remember this specifically, like you should just go clean a house. So it's like they're out there.
Yeah. And what is also disturbing is kind of as you said, you like, we don't know that that was a man who said that. And it's disturbing that it could have been a woman that subscribes to this idea. And it's, I'm not going to comment on if it's a man or not,
Right.
but it, it's just disturbing that that comment could come from anyone.
Right.
Means that
Exactly.
there are men who are out there who do think like that, and I think it comes back to this idea of how social media, and even if you look at like TikTok, and if you kind of are looking for those things and your algorithm becomes, you know,
That
things like Andrew Tate, it's like there are young individuals watching this who are now being every day when they go on TikTok, they're seeing this and they're learning this. And I think because of the way that social media is going, you're not seeing anything else. And so it becomes this kind of like echo chamber of like toxic masculinity and misogyny and hatefulness that is hard to escape. And especially, with online forums like 4chan and Discord, there's so much going on there where it's so easy to get stuck in those
yeah.
places of hate, and to learn that it's just really disheartening to see, I guess. But I mean, I'm hopeful. I think with the amount of there are, I mean, we're talking a lot about how many people there are who subscribe to this, but there are a lot of people who are working really hard to also change this, and I think that it gives me hope. I think that
Yeah.
it will change over time.
It'll just take time, but um Nicola, so as a crisis counselor and knowing the effects of toxic masculinity, especially like in your clients, what would you say are the mental health effects of toxic masculinity against, men and young boys?
I think there are so many, and a lot of times it can lead to increased depression because we're looking at these kind of ideas of um, what men are supposed to be. And we kind of touched on this before when we were talking about how there are also women who subscribe to this. It can feed into those insecurities that people have, that they're not good enough or they're not enough of a man, which can lead to anxiety, depression, all those kinds of things. And I have had clients where, and it's not that they subscribe to toxic masculinity, but it actually just made me think of this, is it can also have implications for men in the court systems. Like, for example, with custody hearings, a lot of the time men have a more difficult time showing that they should get custody of their children because of this idea that mothers are inherently better parents, are more caring, are more, beneficial for children, where that may not be true. And I've had clients where that is most definitely not true, but they have a lot of trouble in the court systems showing that they should have custody of their children, even if it was a situation where it was domestic violence against them. And um, I think that too, if you look at how that affects survivors of domestic violence, just mentally, where and just speaking on like heterosexual couples right now, where it's a man and the perpetrator is a woman, it's this thing of like, it takes a lot longer for them to reach out. It takes a lot longer to recognize that as abuse because of these ideas of men should be strong, men should be the ones with the power in the relationship. And a lot of the time they won't tell anyone because it's like it's embarrassing or it's emasculating to tell people that. And again, depression, anxiety, PTSD that you can get from that because you're not able to find help. And we spoke about suicide rates.
Right.
That's also a concerning factor in this. And I think it's just overall, it's not good for anyone. And it's not good for the men that it affects. And it's hard seeing that, especially kind of with like domestic violence and sexual assaults, where it is that kind of like, it's not the usual, I guess, what people would think is the usual, a man perpetrating this against a woman. When it's flipped, it can have very unique mental health effects on men that kind of differs from the ones that women have.
Right. And I also do want to add a point too. Like, as I give trainings and as I talk about statistics when it comes to domestic violence and sexual violence, you'll see that the rates for men, they're lower, very significantly lower. But that's because that you also have to take into the account that it's underreported. So there are men who are in a domestic violence relationship. There are men who get out of a domestic violence relationship. There are men who are raped. There are men who do experience sexual assaults, but their rates, the statistics are lower because once again, of the stigma associated with it, the gender roles imposed on them, that they don't want to come forward because in their eyes, society is going to shame them. They're going to look at them and say, well, you could have prevented that. You could have stopped that. So thank you for sharing that. So, Nicola, what does healthy masculinity look like?
It looks like anything that that person wants it to look like. Um, I think that anything can be masculine and anything can be feminine, and it doesn't need to be this like there's one way to be a man. I think men being who they are is healthy masculinity, and that's perfect. And if they don't want to do skincare because they don't care about their skin, that's fine. They don't have to do that. But if they want to because they do care about their skin and that's something that's important to them, I'd like to see, a definition of masculinity that's open enough that people can do whatever they want. And it can just be, you can be masculine and you can wear the clothes that you want. You can wear makeup and you can still be a masculine person. Like, you don't have to have these specific characteristics. And I think it actually made me think of a client that I have. We had a discussion about this client has a son, and um, we talk a lot about his son, and he's a great dad, and the way that he teaches him about just like the world, feelings, things like that is very much like open about their feelings, being very caring with one another. And um, I think something that is also important to think about is kind of how we're modeling to younger children. And that's something that we speak about a lot, because I think part of healthy masculinity is feeling feelings and knowing how to deal with those feelings is a big part of that. Because obviously in toxic masculinity you can have feelings, but it has to be like anger, um irritation, or feeling happy. Like, it can't be like just feeling sad. It has to be like these extreme emotions. And I think part of healthy masculinity is, one, being able to express feelings across like the whole broad range of feelings, but also knowing how to self-regulate and how to manage those feelings, and being able to model that to other children and young men, and kind of creating that cycle of like, look at me, it's okay, I'm still a man and I still do these things and it's okay. And also I think, and this is kind of like, I don't know if this is with the question, but I just thought of this. I think the LGBTQ community, and specifically transgender individuals, have had in history and still continue to have such a large role in changing the ideas of what masculinity and femininity looks like. And as much as we've spoken about kind of the violence that they experience because of this, I think that they've played such a huge role in shifting those ideas as well. And so a lot of that change is also coming from the LGBTQ community as well. And I think that's also important to recognize. And I think that just plays a big role in kind of defining what these concepts even mean.
I think you actually answered my last question, but I'm just going to ask it again to see if you have anything else to add. So thank you so much, Nicola, for being so like thorough and explaining your answers like amazing. So what change would you say is needed to prevent the spread of toxic gender roles?
And I think we've spoken about this, but it's talking about it. One is, speaking about how these gender roles harm men, women, non-binary people, anybody in the LGBTQ community, and kind of acknowledging that, but also just kind of modeling for the youth. Makes me feel so old when I say that, but for the youth, and helping them see that you don't have to subscribe to this. And I think for every person that there is trying to push this kind of idea of these gender roles and things like that, um, we have to have people on this side trying to say you don't need to take part in that. And I think being open about, doing what you want to do, because there may be, I think it's also important to think about, maybe there's a woman who does want to stay at home and take care of her children and be, a stay-at-home mom. There's nothing wrong with that inherently. If that's what you want to do because you want to do that, that's fine. It's a very different situation than someone who feels like they have to because they're a woman. Or, because if a man wants to be a stay-at-home dad, there's nothing wrong with that if that's what he wants to do. And I think that's more celebrated in a way now because it's, going against a gender role. But I think also part of not spreading these gender roles is also accepting people who want to do things that may be part of the gender roles, but just because they want to do it, not because of these ideas. But celebrating all of it, just being open and just expanding these ideas of masculinity and femininity. And at the end of the day, it's all made up. Like, none of it's real. None of this is even a real, even if you look at biology is like, it's not this binary concept, and we're not born with certain traits, and it's just all a lot more complicated than I think gender roles make it seem. And I think being more realistic about that and more accepting of that is the first step in us preventing them from becoming this cycle that just continues forever.
Nicola, thank you so much for that. So basically, Nicola and I are advocating for each of you to be authentic, to be your true selves. Toxic masculinity, toxic femininity, like it's made up. Be yourself. And yes, there are people out there who, no matter what, they will find a way to hate. They will find a way to spread, violence, but it's important that you stay true to who you are. And yeah, Nicola, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. Honestly, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but it was one of my favorite ones.
Oh,
So
good.
thank you so much for taking your time to be here with me.
Well, thank you for having me. I have loved doing this with you, and this is my first podcast with you, so I'm
I
excited.
know. And we have so many more to come. Nicola and Hannah's podcast. That's how we're going to brand it. Nicola has so many great ideas. So thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. The views and opinions expressed by podcast participants are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. This podcast content is made available for informational and educational purposes, and the VSC does not make any representation or warranties with respect to the accuracy or completeness of the content. While we make every effort to ensure that the information we are sharing is accurate, we welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear, and you are not alone.